Hey friends, it's your teen and tween librarian Rebecca, and we're back for another episode of Bedtime Stories. Last episode, Axel and the professor did a little exploring, investigating, and discovering in a giant mushroom forest, and they also talked about the fact that there was tides in this underground ocean, and then they discovered that Hans has been building a raft out of fossilized wood. And this chapter, we're going to see them actually set sail and head out onto the Lidenbrock Sea, which I'm very excited because I can't imagine it's going to be a simple boat trip, right? Let's get into chapter 32. Chapter 32, We Set Sail. On the 13th of August, we awoke early in the morning, eager to adopt a new mode of traveling which was both rapid and easy. The raft's rigging consisted of a mast made of 2 staves lashed together, a yard made of a third, and a sail borrowed from our stock of rugs. There was no lack of ropes, and the whole vessel was well made. The provisions, baggage, instruments, arms, and a large amount of fresh water were put on board, and at 6 o'clock the professor gave the order to embark. Hans had fitted up a rudder which enabled him to steer his vessel, and he took the tiller. I cast off the rope mooring us to the shore, and the sail was set, and we put off quickly. Just as we were leaving the little harbor, my uncle, who liked naming places, suggested giving it a name, and proposed mine, among others. "I've a better name to propose to you," I said. "And what's that?" "Gräuben. Port Gräuben would look very well on the map." "Port Gräuben it shall be." And that is how the memory of my dear Virlandaise was associated with our adventurous expedition. The wind was blowing from the northwest. We sailed before it at a great speed. The dense atmosphere had tremendous force and acted on the sail like a powerful fan. After an hour, my uncle had been able to calculate our speed. "If we go on at this rate," he said, "we shall cover at least 75 miles in 24 hours, and it won't be long before we reach the opposite shore." I did not reply, but went and sat forward. Already the north shore was sinking on the horizon, and the shores to the east and west were opening outwards as if to facilitate our departure. Before my eyes there stretched a vast sea. The grayish shadows of great clouds swept across its surface, and seemed to weigh down on the gloomy waters. The silvery beams of the electric light, reflected here and there by drops of spray, produced luminous points in the eddies created by the raft. Soon all land was lost to view. No fixed object could be seen, and if it had been not for our foaming wake, I might have had the thought that our raft was perfectly still. About midday, some huge shoals of seaweed came in sight, floating on the surface of the waves. I was aware of the prolific nature of these plants, which grow at a depth of 12,000 feet at the bottom of the sea, reproduce themselves under a pressure of 400 atmospheres, and often form shoals big enough to impede the course of a ship. But never, I think, was there any seaweed as gigantic as that which we saw on the Lidenbrock Sea. Our raft skirted Fuci 3,000 or 4,000 feet long, huge serpents stretching away out of sight. I amused myself by following with my eyes these endless ribbons, constantly thinking that I had reached the end of them. But for hours on end, my patience was exercised as much as my surprise. What natural force could produce such plants? And what must the earth have looked like in the first periods of its formation, when, under the action of heat and moisture, the vegetable kingdom above was developing on its surface? Evening came, but, as I had noticed the previous day, the luminosity of the air was in no way diminished. This was a constant phenomenon, the permanency of which could be relied on. After supper, I stretched out at the foot of the mast, and it was not long before I fell into a sleep full of pleasant dreams. Hans, motionless at the tiller, let the raft run on. With the wind blowing aft, there was no need for steering. As soon as we had left Port Gräuben, my uncle had instructed me to keep the log, noting down every observation and recording interesting phenomena, The direction of the wind, the speed of our raft, the distance covered, in fact, every particular of our strange voyage. I shall therefore confine myself to reproducing these daily notes, written down, so to speak, at the dictation of events, in order to furnish an exact record of our passage. Friday, the 14th of August. Steady northwest wind, raft sailing fast and straight. Coast 75 miles to leeward. Nothing on the horizon. Intensity of light constant. Weather fine, in other words, the clouds are high up, fleecy, and bathed in a white atmosphere like melting silver. Thermometer at 32 degrees centigrade. At midday, Hans fastened a hook at the end of a line and baited it with a small piece of meat and threw it into the sea. For 2 hours he caught nothing, and we began to think that these waters were uninhabited. But then there was a pull at the line. Hans drew it in and brought a struggling fish out of the water. "A fish!" cried my uncle. "It's a sturgeon!" I cried in my turn. "A small sturgeon!" The professor examined the creature carefully and came to a different conclusion. This fish had a flat, rounded head, and the front part of its body was covered with bony scales. It had fairly well-developed pectoral fins, but no teeth or tail. It certainly belonged to the family in which naturalists have classed the sturgeon, but differed from that fish in some essential details. My uncle noted this, for after a brief examination he said, "This fish belongs to a family which has long been extinct, and which is to be found only in a fossil state in the Devonian strata." "What?" I cried. "You mean we've taken alive one of the inhabitants of those primitive seas?" "Yes," replied the professor, continuing his observations, "and you can see that these fossil fishes are quite unlike the present-day species. Finding one of these creatures alive is sheer bliss for a naturalist." "But to what family does it belong?" "To the order of the ganoids, the family of the Cephalosphides. I'm going to leave this in. That's a hard word. Cephalosphides. The genus, the genus of the Pterictis. I'd swear to that. But this displays a peculiarity common, so they say, to the fishes that inhabit subterranean waters." "What's that?" "It's blind." "Blind?" "It's not only blind, but it has no eyes at all." I looked at the fish. What my uncle had said was perfectly true, but this might be an exceptional case, so the hook was baited again and thrown back into the sea. This ocean is certainly well stocked, for in 2 hours we caught a considerable quantity of Pterictis, as well as some fish belonging to another extinct family, the Dipterides, but of a genus which my uncle could not identify. None of them had eyes. This unexpected haul was extremely beneficial to our food stocks. Thus, it seems clear that this sea contains nothing but fossil species, in which fishes, like reptiles, are all the more completely developed the farther back they were created. Perhaps we may yet come across some of those saurians, which scientists have reconstructed on the basis of a bit of bone or cartilage. I took the telescope and examined the sea. It was deserted. No doubt we are still too near the shore. I looked up in the air. Why should not some of those birds reconstructed by the immortal Cuvier be beating their wings in this dense atmosphere? The fish would provide them with sufficient food. I searched the space above me, but the air was as uninhabited as the shore. Now, however, my imagination carried me away among the wonderful hypotheses of paleontology, and I had a prehistoric daydream. I fancied I could see floating on the water some huge chair seats, antediluvian tortoises like floating islands. Along the dark shore, there passed the great mammals of early times, the Leptotherium, found in the caves of Brazil, and the Meracotherium, found in the icy regions of Siberia. Farther on, the Pachydermatous Lophiodon, a gigantic tapir, was hiding behind the rocks, ready to dispute its prey with the Anoplotherium, a strange animal which looks like an amalgam of rhinoceros, horse, hippopotamus, and camel, as if the Creator, in too much of a hurry during the first hours of the world, had combined several animals into one. The giant mastodon waved its trunk and pounded the rocks on the shore with its tusks, while the megatherium, buttressed on its enormous legs, burrowed into the earth, rousing the echoes of granite rocks with its roars. Higher up, the Protopithecus, the first monkey to appear on Earth, was climbing on the steep peaks. Higher still, the pterodactyl, with its winged claws, glided like a huge bat through the dense air. And finally, in the upper strata of the atmosphere, some enormous birds, more powerful than the cassowary and bigger than the ostrich, spread their vast wings and soared upwards to touch with their heads the ceiling of the granite vault. The whole of this fossil world came to life again in my imagination. I went back to the scriptural periods of creation, long before the birth of man, when the unfinished world was not yet ready for him. Then my dream took me even further back into the ages before the appearance of living creatures. The mammals disappeared, then the birds, then the reptiles of the secondary period, and finally the fishes, crustaceans, mollusks, and articulated creatures. The zoophytes of the transitional period returned to nothingness in their turn. The whole of life was concentrated in me, and my heart was the only one beating in that depopulated world. There were no more seasons or climates. The heat of the globe steadily increased and neutralized that of the sun. The vegetation grew to gigantic proportions, and I passed like a ghost among arborescent ferns, treading uncertainly on iridescent marl and mottled stone. I leaned against the trunks of huge conifers. I lay down in the shade of Sphenophilus, Astrophilus, and lycopods 100 feet high. Centuries passed like days. I went back through the long series of terrestrial changes. The plants disappeared, the granite rocks softened, solid matter turned to liquid under the action of intense heat, water covered the surface of the globe, boiling and volatilizing, steam enveloped the earth, which gradually turned into a gaseous mass, white-hot, as big and bright as the sun. In the center of this nebula, which was 1,400,000 times as large as the globe it would one day form, I was carried through interplanetary space. My body was volatilized in its turn and mingled like an imponderable atom with these vast vapors tracing their flaming orbits through infinity. What a dream this was! Where was it taking me? My feverish hand noted down on paper the strange details of my journey. I had forgotten everything else. The professor, the guide, and the raft. A hallucination had taken hold of me. "What's the matter?" asked my uncle. My staring eyes looked at him without seeing him. "Take care, Axel, or you'll fall overboard." At the same time, I felt Hans seizing me. But for him, I would have thrown myself into the sea under the influence of my dream. "Has he gone mad?" cried the professor. "What is it?" I said at last, coming to. "Are you ill?" "No. I've had a brief hallucination, but it is over now. Is everything all right?" "Yes, there's a fair wind and a fine sea. We are making good headway, and unless my calculations are wrong, we shall soon make land." At these words, I stood up and gazed at the horizon, but there was still nothing to be seen between water and clouds. And that's the end of chapter 32.